Cut the interference. Now. Captain Dorian Vex didn't have time for guesswork. His eyes flicked across the shifting feed on the laser plasma display, the fractured data stream struggling against cosmic distortion. A signal, faint but deliberate, clawing its way through deep space interference. Lieutenant Orion Kess, hunched over the communications console, was already working his magic. The dim glow of the displays illuminated his sharp features, sweat beading along his temple as his fingers danced across the controls. "I'm boosting the array." "This thing's been bouncing through dead space for days," Kess muttered. A burst of static, then clarity. A voice, weary and strained, emerged through the distortion. "This is High Seer Varos Thren of the Sathari Collective. Our worlds burn. The Dominion shows no mercy. If there is anyone who values more than conquest, hear us, please, before all that we are is turned to ash." Silence settled over the bridge, thick as smoke before a detonation. Major Stellan Reese, standing with arms crossed, exhaled through his nose, his posture the very picture of restrained tension. "That's not a request for trade. That's desperation." Vex leaned forward, elbows resting on his console, mind already assembling possibilities. "Location?" Kess scanned through data markers. "Sathari home system, 5 days out at standard FTL, 2 if we push the drive past safety limits." He paused, then turned toward Vex. "Sir, we're looking at a dead zone. No allied activity. Nothing but Dominion signatures." And that was the problem. The Volrath Dominion, a species known for its systematic eradication of resistance, its fleets moving like precision-forged weapons, its planetary invasions meticulous in execution. The Galactic Council had hesitated, reluctant to provoke an empire that seemed hell-bent on claiming every unprotected system. Earth wasn't a recognized military power among the larger interstellar players, still considered an anomaly in the galactic order. But none of that mattered when the message screamed of extinction. "Command won't approve intervention." Reese's voice was level, but there was an edge beneath it. "They'll call it someone else's problem." Vex didn't argue. They both knew Fleet Command played the long game, weighing every move like a chess match. But some things weren't meant to be measured in political cost. He straightened. "We move in. Stealth protocols. No transmissions. If this is a trap, we'll know before they do." Reese nodded once. No argument. Just purpose. Kess hesitated before locking in the course. "We hit a Dominion war zone unannounced. We're playing with fire." Vex's gaze never wavered. "Then we'll make sure they burn first." The ESS Revenant cut through the void, a specter moving in the spaces where no light followed. All active emissions silenced, its blackened hull absorbed the distant gleam of shattered worlds. As the ship dropped into the Sathari system, a landscape of devastation unfolded on the laser plasma displays. Entire continents smoldered, cityscapes reduced to skeletal remains. What once stood as centers of culture and innovation lay in silent obliteration, the remnants of a civilization hanging in ruin beneath the watchful orbit of Dominion warships. Reese surveyed the live combat feed from the forward reconnaissance probes. Population centers are gutted. The only resistance left is scattered. Kess locked onto Dominion fleet movements. No wasted positioning. They don't just glass planets. They break them apart layer by layer. Vex studied the enemy formations. The Volrath fleets moved with deliberate, terrifying unity, their ships shifting ranks with the synchronicity of a living organism. No wasted motion, no hesitation. And yet they left no gaps to exploit. This wasn't a slaughter. This was calculated extinction. "Sir?" Kess straightened. "Got something. Low-band transmissions from one of the ruined sectors. Some Sathari are still alive down there." Vex narrowed his eyes. "Dominion patrols?" "Running sweeps. Systematic. The survivors won't last long." The decision was instant. "Reese, prep a strike team." Reese turned, issuing orders through the command net, before vanishing into the lift. Kess muttered under his breath as he finalized planetary descent vectors. "We're not just observers anymore." Vex watched the Dominion fleet shift position. a precision dance of destruction playing out in orbit. His jaw set. We never were. The dropship burned through atmosphere, its engines a whisper as it wove through the ruins. Smoke curled through shattered skyscrapers, the air thick with the stench of charred metal and dying embers. Every shadow could be a threat. Reese and his men moved like ghosts through the rubble, armor absorbing light, footsteps measured. Sathari distress signals guided them toward what remained of a civilian shelter, half buried under the wreckage of its own infrastructure. A shape moved ahead, tattered, weak, barely standing. A Sathari male, deep gashes marring his pale skin. He flinched at their approach, but when he saw Reese human armor, confusion flickered across his features. You're not Volrath. Reese lowered his rifle. We're getting you out. The Sathari's lips parted in something between relief and disbelief. There are more. Below. Then the sky ignited. A Dominion patrol craft swept over the ruins, its spotlights cutting jagged paths through the rubble. The second they were spotted, a shockwave of energy fire ripped through the air, tearing apart anything in its wake. Reese barked into comms. Contact! The Revenant, already tracking their position, responded immediately. A high-orbit kinetic strike slammed into the Dominion craft mid-maneuver, rupturing it into a flaming spiral that crashed into a ruined tower. The shockwave tore through the street, sending debris flying. The Sathari survivor stared in stunned silence at the burning wreckage. Reese pulled him to his feet. Move! The squad reached the buried shelter entrance, breaching the structure with controlled detonation charges. Inside, dozens of Sathari huddled in the dark, fear etched into their expressions. And then they saw humans, standing at the threshold, weapons raised, but not at them. Hope flickered in their eyes for the first time. Reese activated his comms. We've got them, extracting now. But before the dropship could lift off, Dominion reinforcements descended like vultures. Vex's voice cut through the comms. Hold position. We're sending a message. High in orbit, the Revenant's railgun turrets adjusted. The first barrage of kinetic slugs tore through Dominion troop transports before they could touch the ground. The second wave ripped through their flanking maneuver, obliterating their formations before they could deploy. It wasn't just a counterattack. It was an execution. The Sathari, watching from the ground, saw something they hadn't seen in weeks. Dominion forces faltering, their ironclad formation broken apart like rusted machinery. Humans didn't fight fair. They didn't fight for conquest. They fought to win. As the Revenant's dropship ascended, the Sathari looked back at the burning wreckage of their world. The despair was still there, but something else had taken root. Something fierce. Vex's voice came through the ship's comms, steady as steel. This war isn't over. His eyes remained locked on the laser plasma displays, where Dominion warships realigned, already adapting. Dominion fleet formations are shifting. They're adjusting. Vex stood at the command dais, eyes fixed on the laser plasma display. The Dominion ships no longer hovered in static formations, their once immaculate symmetry dissolving into adaptive motion patterns. Each vessel moved with a calculated rhythm, closing gaps that hadn't existed before. Lieutenant Orion Kess worked the comm systems with tight, deliberate movements. They're learning, he muttered. That was fast. Major Stellan Reese leaned against the tactical console, gaze hardened. They don't have a doctrine for us yet, but give them time. He exhaled through his nose. They will. Vex turned to his war council, the bridge crew watching the unfolding battle with measured intensity. Then we don't give them time. We hit them from the inside. A strategy was already forming. The Volrath's greatest strength lay in their rigid formation-based combat, a war machine synchronized to perfection, but perfection could be corrupted. Reese, take a team groundside. We need their supply chain bleeding before their fleet consolidates. Reese gave a single nod and strode toward the exit. Vex turned to Kess. Start flooding their communications with controlled noise, misdirection, echoed signals. Convince them the Sathari still have fighting strength in the outer sectors. Kess smirked as he cracked his knuckles. Ghost armies it is. The wolves were being unleashed. The Sathari ruins bore no silence, only whispers of war, the distant drone of Volrath patrols, the crackling embers of a dying city, the muffled cries of survivors in hiding. Reese moved through the shattered streets, his men gliding through the wreckage like shadows. Each footstep was measured, each movement part of a larger rhythm. They weren't seen. They weren't heard. Ulik Vayan, the Sathari guide, motioned toward a crumbling structure ahead. Their supply routes converge at the substructure beneath that compound. If you're cutting off their lifeline, it's there. Reese motioned his squad forward. The Sathari had once built their cities with flowing elegance, but now those structures stood as monuments to a war they never asked for. Their objective was a central Dominion stockpile, nestled beneath the bones of what had once been a university. Now it was a logistical, heart-pumping life into the enemy war machine. Reese crouched near an overturned transport, signaling Kess. "We're in position." Kess's voice crackled through the comm. "Their logistics AI is still transmitting fleet resupply timetables. Let me rearrange their priorities." From orbit, the Revenant's AI warfare suite went to work. Data streams corrupted. Manifest logs altered. Dominion supply ships received falsified orders, rerouting them into dead zones where no forces awaited. The Volrath would soon find their own resources working against them. Reese checked his chrono. 8 minutes until patrol rotation. No room for error. He motioned to his men. "Set the charges. No fireballs. Collapse, not destruction. We bury them alive." The demolition experts got to work, placing seismic cutters in key support junctions, each charge calibrated for structural failure rather than detonation. Then the unexpected happened. Reese caught the sound of grinding stone, the unmistakable weight of something heavy moving above them. A Volrath patrol unit had altered its route, not blindly following its usual track, but adapting. His instincts screamed. They knew something was off. "Get it done, now!" The first barrage of kinetic slugs tore through Dominion troop transports before they could touch the ground. The second wave ripped through their flanking maneuver, obliterating their formations before they could deploy. It wasn't just a counterattack. It was an execution. The Sathari, watching from the ground, saw something they hadn't seen in weeks. Dominion forces faltering, their ironclad formation broken apart like rusted machinery. Humans didn't fight fair. They didn't fight for conquest. They fought to win. As the Revenant's dropship ascended, the Sathari looked back at the burning wreckage of their world. The despair was still there, but something else had taken root. Something fierce. Vex's voice came through the ship's comms, steady as steel. "This war isn't over." His eyes remained locked on the laser plasma displays, where Dominion warships realigned, already adapting. Dominion fleet formations are shifting. They're adjusting. Vex stood at the command dais, eyes fixed on the laser plasma display. The Dominion ships no longer hovered in static formations, their once immaculate symmetry dissolving into adaptive motion patterns. Each vessel moved with a calculated rhythm, closing gaps that hadn't existed before. Lieutenant Orion Kess worked the comm systems with tight, deliberate movements. "They're learning," he muttered. That was fast. Major Stellan Reese leaned against the tactical console, gaze hardened. "They don't have a doctrine for us yet, but give them time." He exhaled through his nose. "They will." Vex turned to his war council, the bridge crew watching the unfolding battle with measured intensity. "Then we don't give them time. We hit them from the inside." A strategy was already forming. The Volrath's greatest strength lay in their rigid formation-based combat. A war machine synchronized to perfection, but perfection could be corrupted. "Reese, take a team groundside. We need their supply chain bleeding before their fleet consolidates." Reese gave a single nod and strode toward the exit. Vex turned to Kess. "Start flooding their communications with controlled noise, misdirection, echoed signals. Convince them the Sathari still have fighting strength in the outer sectors." Kess smirked as he cracked his knuckles. "Ghost armies it is." The wolves were being unleashed. The Sathari ruins bore no silence, only whispers of war, the distant drone of Volrath patrols, the crackling embers of a dying city, the muffled cries of survivors in hiding. Reese moved through the shattered streets, his men gliding through the wreckage like shadows. Each footstep was measured, each movement part of a larger rhythm. They weren't seen. They weren't heard. Ulik Vayan, the Sathari guide, motioned toward a crumbling structure ahead. Their supply routes converge at the substructure beneath that compound. If you're cutting off their lifeline, it's there. Reese motioned his squad forward. The Sathari had once built their cities with flowing elegance, but now those structures stood as monuments to a war they never asked for. Their objective was a central Dominion stockpile, nestled beneath the bones of what had once been a university. Now it was a logistical, heart-pumping life into the enemy war machine. Reese crouched near an overturned transport, signaling Kess. "We're in position." Kess's voice crackled through the comm. "Their logistics AI is still transmitting fleet resupply timetables. Let me rearrange their priorities." From orbit, the Revenant's AI warfare suite went to work. Data streams corrupted. Manifest logs altered. Dominion supply ships received falsified orders, rerouting them into dead zones where no forces awaited. The Volrath would soon find their own resources working against them. Reese checked his chrono. 8 minutes until patrol rotation. No room for error. He motioned to his men. "Set the charges. No fireballs. Collapse, not destruction. We bury them alive." The demolition experts got to work, placing seismic cutters in key support junctions, each charge calibrated for structural failure rather than detonation. Then the unexpected happened. Reese caught the sound of grinding stone, the unmistakable weight of something heavy moving above them. A Volrath patrol unit had altered its route, not blindly following its usual track, but adapting. His instincts screamed. They knew something was off. "Get it done now!" The team worked faster, hands moving in practiced efficiency. Reese lifted his rifle, scanning the upper floors as shadows shifted against the firelit skyline. Then the Volrath strike team descended. The first shots tore through the air, a brutal crossfire erupting as Reese's team scattered into pre-planned fallback positions. The Volrath were methodical, advancing with layered suppression tactics, cutting off escape routes, forcing them into tightened killing zones. Reese ducked behind a fractured pillar, switching to thermal optics. The enemy moved like a hive mind, each soldier compensating for the losses of another. No hesitation, no gaps. Except they weren't used to humans. They expected predictable movement. Reese took advantage of that. He didn't fight the way they wanted him to. "Detonate the charges." The underground support beams fractured in an instant, a sickening groan of collapsing stone shaking the battlefield. Volrath soldiers reeled as the ground beneath them gave way, entire supply caches swallowed by a manufactured landslide. Reese's team moved. They slipped through the chaos, cutting through scattered Volrath squads with short, brutal engagements. The skies above them burned as Kess's cyber warfare unleashed dozens of false signals, drawing enemy reinforcements in the wrong direction. The extraction ship hovered low, engines straining against the heat. Reese hauled Vayan inside. "Get us airborne!" The ship tore skyward, weaving through Volrath anti-air emplacements, each plasma burst streaking past like falling stars. Then, just as they cleared the war-torn skyline, the comm crackled with Kess's voice. Sharp, urgent. "We have a problem." Back aboard the Revenant, Vex watched the laser plasma displays shift. The Ghost Fleet illusion had worked too well. Instead of retreating, the Volrath were mobilizing in full-scale retaliation. "They're not second-guessing," Kess said, tension in his voice. "They're reinforcing. Hard." Vex's stomach coiled with realization. They know we're here. And worse than that, the Volrath Supreme War Master himself had taken command. Ovrak Kuldrin, a name that sent fleets crumbling. A warlord whose campaigns never ended in stalemate, only extermination. And now he was coming for them. "They're not just hunting us anymore," Kess murmured, fingers tightening over the interface. "They're consolidating." Vex watched the heads-up display where Volrath fleet patterns were shifting in real time. Fractured movement had given way to unity. No longer reacting, no longer second-guessing. The Dominion was closing the noose. They've decided to end this. War Master Ovrak Kuldrin had entered the battlefield. His forces no longer scrambled for advantage. They moved with singular purpose, their fleets converging into a battle-hardened phalanx that consumed everything in its path. The Sathari had no more cities left to lose. Their last remaining enclaves clung to life in fractured subterranean networks, the old tunnels once built for transport now serving as tombs in waiting. If Cauldron wasn't stopped here, there would be nothing left of them to save. Vex exhaled, staring at the illuminated battlefield before him. Then we don't let them end it on their terms. His officers turned toward him, waiting. We bait them in, make them believe they've forced our hand, draw them into a battlefield of our making. His voice held no hesitation. And then we break them. Reese crouched among the collapsed structures of the Sathari capital, surveying the sunken labyrinth of shattered architecture. What had once been graceful city spires now jutted at unnatural angles. Entire blocks tilted into craters formed by Dominion orbital fire. But destruction wasn't the end. It was an opportunity. He tapped his comm. Kess, bring up the structural maps. A detailed three-dimensional wireframe flickered onto his wrist display, marking load-bearing points, subterranean connectors, and unstable layers beneath the ruins. This city wasn't built to collapse, Kess's voice crackled through. It was built to redistribute weight. We overload specific points, and we turn it into a sinkhole, Reese finished. He looked up as his team moved, Sathari freedom fighters working alongside human demolition crews. The survivors had no military training, but grief had sharpened them into something ruthless. Vian approached, gripping a detonation pack. We bring their gods down to bury them. Reese gave a sharp nod. Then let's get to work. The ESS Revenant drifted in low orbit, running on minimal emissions, hidden among the debris field of destroyed Sathari satellites. Vex watched as false transmissions flooded Volrath comms. A careful mixture of distress signals and scrambled tactical relays painted an irresistible illusion. A fractured human force retreating toward the last Sathari stronghold, exposed, vulnerable, desperate. Cauldron took the bait. Volrath ground forces mobilized en masse, pushing toward the Sathari ruins like a tide drawn to shore. Their forward advance tightened, compressed into the pathways humanity had carved out for them. Above, Dominion warships repositioned, bringing their heaviest vessels into a tight orbital column for support bombardment. Exactly where they were meant to be. Vex's fingers curled into a fist. Detonate the first wave. The detonation charges triggered in perfect succession, a deep, resonating crack splitting through the Sathari ruins. Reese barely had time to signal the retreat before the world fractured beneath the Dominion battalions. Entire streets gave way, swallowing hundreds of enemy warforms into a maelstrom of dust and stone. Reinforcement vehicles tumbled into the abyss, their thrusters sputtering uselessly against the sheer magnitude of the collapse. The air itself shuddered with the weight of the destruction. The Volrath assault stalled, their once flawless advance fragmented as they scrambled to assess the unexpected catastrophe. That hesitation was all the opening they would ever get. Now! The Revenant dropped cloak and unleashed its payload. A full-scale kinetic strike rained from the warship's rotating magnetic cannons, each round piercing the weakened landscape like a blade through exposed flesh. Volrath heavy armor shattered under the impact, explosions rippling outward as their own munitions ignited from concussive shockwaves. Airborne transports detonated mid-flight, caught in the chaos of the cascading chain reactions. Volrath fleet commanders barked fractured orders, their formations crumbling under the onslaught. For the first time in their war doctrine, they faced an enemy who fought on no predictable terms. And they were losing. From the heart of the Dominion command vessel, War Master Cauldron watched the slaughter unfold, his mandibles clicking in controlled thought. The Volrath did not suffer total losses. Even amid devastation, their war machine adapted, regaining footing where weaker species would have fallen apart. He studied the combat streams, the pattern of Earth's assault, the tactics that had shattered centuries of refined doctrine. Human warfare was not about advancing or retreating. It was something else entirely. They fought like predators. They fought to dismantle. Cold understanding settled within him. Cauldron pressed a single command sequence into his war console. If they could not win this world, then it would not exist for anyone else. A new directive cascaded through Volrath fleet transmissions. Planetary annihilation protocols activated. The Sathari world had just minutes left to live. "The sky is breaking." The words left Vayan's lips in a breathless rasp as he stared up at the Sathari heavens, his elongated pupils constricting against the overwhelming glow of planetary ignition. The upper atmosphere churned in unnatural turbulence, streaked with flickering columns of light as the Volrath's extinction sequence began. From orbit, enormous obelisk-like warships descended in unison, their underbellies releasing seething energy pulses that crackled into the stratosphere. The effect was immediate. Cloud formations tore apart as firestorms ignited, oxygen density destabilizing with each successive wave. Volrath atmospheric disruptors weren't designed for conquest. They were designed to erase entire biospheres. Vex watched it unfold through the heads-up display, his throat tightening. The data feed flickered with casualty projections, the numbers climbing faster than his mind could process. "How long until total collapse?" Kess's voice was uncharacteristically grim. "Atmo burn reaches critical in 30 minutes. After that, nothing's walking away from this planet. Not Sathari, not Volrath, not us." Reese's response was immediate. "We start evacuating. Now." Vex didn't move. His eyes tracked the Volrath Grand Armada, its sheer magnitude overwhelming even Earth's most advanced war simulations. This wasn't a fleet. It was a verdict. The Revenant couldn't hold the line. The Sathari couldn't outlast what was coming. Every calculation led to a single conclusion. "We're not fighting this battle," Vex said. Reese stiffened. "What are you suggesting?" Vex exhaled through his nose. "We kill the one giving the order." Kuldrin. No single warlord had orchestrated more planetary cullings. He was the core directive of the Dominion war machine, and right now he was on that flagship, believing himself untouchable. Vex turned to Kess. "How much stealth capacity do we have left?" "Enough to get a strike team on board, barely, but the Revenant's cloak won't survive full-spectrum sweeps. If we do this, we're fighting blind the second we breach." Reese's jaw tightened. "And the ship?" Vex's voice didn't waver. "It stays behind, as bait." Silence stretched between them. Reese stared at him, expression unreadable. Then, with the slow deliberation of a soldier who had long made peace with impossible choices, he reached for his sidearm and checked its charge. "Then let's make it count." The Revenant pivoted into a direct intercept vector, dropping into atmospheric descent to mask its approach. The ruse had to be convincing. Make the Dominion believe the ship was making a last desperate stand. Let them come. Let them focus. Let them believe. Vex and his strike team slipped from the vessel before the Volrath even had the chance to realize what they had let through their defenses. The stealth shuttle was silent through the chaos, threading between flaming debris fields and shattered Sathari orbital stations. The Dominion flagship loomed ahead, its surface a labyrinth of shifting defensive grids, pulsar cannons locking onto battlefield targets with inhuman precision. Reese readied his weapons as the shuttle's airlock cycled. "Not a fan of walking into a hornet's nest." Vex barely spared him a glance. "We're not walking in. We're cutting the head off." The team deployed in synchronized motion, breaching into the underbelly of the flagship, bypassing external defenses by slipping through its external heat vents before reactivation cycles completed. They landed inside a service bay, shadows against the gunmetal architecture. Kess immediately pulled up a scan of the ship's interior. "Command bridge is 20 levels up. Security's concentrated along critical power relays. Nothing between us and the warlord except elite guard units." "Then we move fast," Vex murmured. The corridors of the Volrath warship pulsed with ominous dim light, its walls a blend of organic metalwork and structured efficiency. The Dominion built their ships to sustain war for generations, self-repairing, self-adapting, never needing to return to dockyards. It didn't matter. This ship wasn't leaving orbit intact. The first Volrath squad encountered them near a weapons assembly block. The battle was immediate, brutal. Reese moved like a specter, taking down the first target before they had time to register the intrusion. The second fired off a warning pulse, only for Vex to snap his blade through the creature's secondary throat, cutting the sound off before it could reach the command network. They moved level by level, disrupting security nodes as they went. Kess's voice cut through comms. Alarm triggers are dead, but they know something's wrong. Expect reinforcement rotations in 3 minutes. Vex barely acknowledged it. He was already looking ahead, at the final breach point. Beyond the reinforced command doors, War Master Coldren waited. They moved. The explosive charge detonated the final security barricade, sending a shockwave through the command bridge's outer ring. Coldren stood in the heart of the chamber, surrounded by real-time war projections, fleet maneuver schematics, and incoming casualty reports. His mandibles clicked once, slow, measured. "You came to die in my presence," he observed, turning toward them with the serene confidence of something that had never once doubted its own victory. Vex raised his weapon. "Number, I came to end this." The warlord moved like a force of nature, faster than his bulk suggested, covering the distance in a single sweeping motion. Vex barely sidestepped in time, Coldren's blade-like arm appendages slicing through the air where his skull had been. Reese opened fire, but Coldren's secondary arms activated counter-drones, redirecting the projectiles mid-air. Kess was already hacking into the bridge's systems, overriding command authorizations. "Buying you 30 seconds before I can sever the fleet's control structure. Don't die before then." Vex didn't plan to. He twisted around Coldren's next strike, turning the warlord's own momentum against him, forcing him into an off-center pivot. In that fraction of an opening, he fired point-blank into Coldren's exposed secondary heart chamber. The warlord staggered but did not fall. Instead, his mandibles spread in something between amusement and challenge. "You are different," he conceded. "That's the problem with you," Vex shot back, dodging another strike. "You never considered that something different might be your end." Kess's voice suddenly spiked through comms. "Fleet structure is collapsing. Their AI warfare network is eating itself alive. They can't issue full synchronization anymore." That was the opening they needed. Vex drove his knife into Coldren's exposed rib plating, twisting until the warlord finally faltered. The Volrath fleet was breaking down. The Revenant was still alive. Coldren slumped against the console, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes still locked onto Vex, even as life left them. "You believe this is victory?" he rasped. "You have simply made the war larger than you understand." Vex pulled the knife free. "Then we'll handle it when it comes." With Coldren dead, the Volrath invasion collapsed in real time, and as the strike team exfiltrated back to the Revenant, there was only one final order left to give. End their fleet. Leave nothing behind. "Dominion fleet breaking," Kess reported, voice clipped. "Their formations are crumbling. They're cutting and running." Vex didn't react immediately. His eyes were locked onto the laser plasma display, where the battlefield once dominated by Volrath discipline had turned into a slaughterhouse of confusion. With Coldren dead, command nodes fractured, orders conflicted, and entire battalions fell into chaos. Some ships fled outright, retreating into hyperspace without clearance. Others fought in desperation, their captains refusing to acknowledge the impossible that they had lost. The Sathari homeworld, burning but still breathing, remained below them. The last remnants of its people watched from ruined shelters, from hidden tunnels and crumbling towers, staring upward as the force that had wiped out their species for centuries was now shattered before their eyes. Vex exhaled slowly. "Prepare full barrage on remaining fleet clusters." Reese leaned forward. "We're finishing this?" That was the question, wasn't it? It would be easy. A final coordinated strike, the last command to erase the Volrath completely. Their ships, leaderless and spiraling, could be torn apart in minutes. One order. That was all it would take. The Sathari, once pacifists, were no longer speaking of survival. They whispered something darker. Vayen stood rigid on the bridge, fists clenched, his expression unreadable as he watched the carnage unfold. "You should end them," he said at last, his voice colder than it had ever been. "They will return if you don't." Vex knew that. Every rule of war demanded he strike now, and yet something in the pit of his stomach resisted. Because this wasn't war anymore. This was extermination. The same thing Coldren had planned for the Sathari. Vex's fingers hovered over the tactical interface, the final command authorization waiting. His own reflection stared back from the screen, fractured in the gleam of battle reports. Was that how humanity would be known? The species that arrived not as liberators, but executioners, or something else. He made his choice. Disable them. Don't destroy them. A weighted silence filled the bridge. Kess turned his chair, disbelief flickering across his face. Sir? Vex's tone didn't shift. Seize their fleet transmissions. Get me access to every Dominion channel still active. Reese exhaled, shaking his head as he folded his arms. You're really going to let them live? Vex didn't look away from the battlefield. I'm going to make sure they don't forget this day. The transmission went out across every Dominion-controlled sector. The Sithari homeworld skies burned, the last Dominion warships falling into retreat. And at the center of it all, Earth's fleet remained, untouched, unchallenged, standing over the corpse of an empire that had never before known true defeat. On every Volrath world, on every occupied system, the image of Kuldran's broken body flickered into existence, broadcast across Dominion command relays, planetary occupation hubs, and fleet networks. The message was simple. Your warlord is dead. Your fleet has collapsed. You believed you were unbreakable. You were wrong. The illusion of their empire's invincibility was gone. In an instant, every Volrath officer still alive had to face something they had never once considered possible, the idea that they could be defeated. Kess exhaled, leaning back from the console. Every sector received it. No way they're covering that up. Vex stood still, watching the final Dominion ships scatter. Reese let out a low chuckle. So that's it, huh? No mass execution, no final shot. Just make them live with the loss? Vex's voice was quiet. They won't forget it. Yeah, well, some of them are going to call that mercy. Vex finally turned toward him, his gaze unreadable. Good. Then, just as smoothly, he turned back toward Kess. Bring us into formation with the Sithari fleet remnants. Secure their evacuation routes. We'll escort them out of system. Kess nodded, already relaying the orders. The Revenant pivoted, moving into position above the Sithari homeworld. Below, the remains of a broken people stirred in the ashes of their planet, their faces turned skyward. And for the first time in their history, they weren't looking toward death. They were looking at a future they had never believed possible. The Galactic Council convened 3 days later. Vex and his crew didn't attend. They didn't need to. Humanity's message had already been written in the wreckage of a Dominion war machine that had once believed itself untouchable. The Council's debates raged over Earth's actions, over the implications of their intervention, over the consequences of what had just transpired. But there was one truth they could no longer deny. Earth was no longer an unknown variable. They were a force, a wild card in a galactic order that had never truly understood them. And now, they had everyone's attention. As the ESS Revenant prepared for departure, Vian stood beside Vex, his gaze locked onto the Sithari ships preparing for exodus. You could have ended them forever, the Sithari murmured. Vex didn't respond immediately. He simply watched the battlefield, watched the dying fires, watched the remnants of what they had reshaped in a single, decisive battle. They won't recover from this, he finally said. Not as they were. Vayan studied him, then nodded slowly. That is a different kind of death, I suppose. Vex exhaled, stepping forward, activating the final transmission relay. It would be recorded, archived, dissected for generations. It would be the moment that changed everything. And as the transmission rippled across the stars, one final message echoed across Dominion space. To any empire that believes might alone rules the cosmos, remember this day. The Sithari departed. The Revenant followed. The war was over. For now.